Welcome to Caritas Querens. In this series, we're taking a look at the topic of free will, and specifically at some of the arguments that are brought against apokatastasis or Christian universalism from a free will perspective. In this video, I'd like to take a look at the idea that God is bound to respect our free will decisions. This seems to imply that our free will, in a sense, is a right that we have. And by extension, that the decisions we make using our free will are rights that God cannot, in justice, deny us, that he cannot take away from us. And therefore, he has to respect those rights and respect even the consequences of those rights, at least to the point where he cannot deprive us of our free will or override our free will to keep us from doing things that we choose to do using free will, okay? Now, here's where I think that falls apart and what I don't like about that argument, okay? And it is that I would argue that free will is always ordered towards something good. So in that regard, I would kind of side myself at least somewhat with the classical view of free will, that free will is ordered towards something good and ultimately towards the good, towards God himself. But if you watched my earlier video about what is free will, exploring the nature of free will, I also take a little bit from the libertarian model by saying that free will does entail, in some way, a negative perspective. In other words, a lack of some restrictions or limitations. Okay, so my idea is that free will ultimately is our capacity or our ability to make choices or to act ordered towards our own good, ordered towards developing ourselves as persons, towards full union with God, and thereby it's also ordered towards God himself, towards his nature, and in conjunction with that is ordered towards the good of others, which is why the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. So there's love of ourselves and our neighbor. But also, it along with that is the restriction, in a sense, that we cannot deny ourselves, that we are bound to love ourselves in some way, so that even the bad choices we make ultimately must be out of love, out of some good. Okay? So I want to focus on that first part, that our free will is ordered towards something good. So that implies that whenever we make choices, even bad choices, there's ultimately something good in that bad choice. Okay, we're either mistaken about the choice, we think it's good and it's not, or we're making a bad choice but for a good reason, for a good motive, or maybe we're making a choice that has multiple consequences, some good, some bad, and we're choosing it for the good consequences. So we're only partially choosing something bad and partially choosing the good consequences. Okay, but I would argue that ultimately, when we make choices, even bad choices, it involves choosing some good. If you see the earlier video I made about what is free will, I explain how I get to that, especially looking at the scriptural perspective on free will. But I think ultimately it's also kind of a matter of common experience and common sense. I know in my own life, and when I see other people acting, it's hard to avoid the fact that people often make choices for good reasons, at the very least, or there's often something good in the choices they make, even bad choices. And I think in part that's even part of the reason why we can be forgiven and why we can repent. I think if a person were able to choose evil for its own sake, if it were even possible to do that, which I'm not sure it is, because I believe evil is a deprivation. It's a nothing, and I don't know how you can choose nothing. But even if that were possible, then I think it would imply that a person, in a sense, couldn't really repent, because they could really turn their mind and turn their will totally against what is good. And then if they went that route, how could they be called back aside from just a pure miracle of grace and almost a sort of recreation of their very being and of their free will. Anyway, I don't want to get into that right now, okay? But suffice to say, I believe that really ultimately in every free will act, it's always ordered towards something good. So if that's the case, then I don't see how somebody who argues against apokatastasis from a free will perspective can say that ultimately the souls in hell damn themselves. Ultimately, it would seem like what that means is that the souls in hell then are actually are choosing something bad, and okay, you could argue that maybe they're choosing it for a good reason. Maybe they're elevating the exercise of their free will above the consequences of it, and they're saying, even though I know it's going to cause me to suffer, and it's against God's will, and it's against love, and it's against my proper development, nevertheless, at the very least, it enables me to choose what I want to choose. It enables me independence. It's kind of like the portrayal of Satan in Paradise Lost. Like better to how does it go? Better to reign in hell than serve in. I'm sorry. Yeah, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, or something like that. Okay, but here's where that gets a little bit fishy and a little bit tricky. If God is in a sense respecting our free will, then that implies that He is respecting even that misuse of our free will, and it's implying that we have a right to misuse our free will. And I'm going to say that's not true. If our free will is ordered towards what is good, then we don't have a right to use it for what is evil, even indirectly. And in fact, I would say that that's why, oftentimes you get in the New Testament images, like in St. Paul, talking about how sinning is really a sort of form of slavery. It's not a freedom. you know, um, and and paradoxically, that slavery to God really is freeing and is a freedom, because really He ultimately, His will is our freedom. His will is our sanctification, and therefore, by being a slave to Him, He actually enables us to develop our free will and to become more and more free as He reveals the truth to us, and the truth sets us free. Okay. But to sin is really to be in slavery. It is to miss the mark, and we don't have a right to miss the mark. It happens, sure, and it's a possibility, but that doesn't mean it's something that has to be respected and that we have a right to, any more than saying that a baseball player at home plate has a right to swing and miss. Okay, sure, it's a possibility, but that's not why he's there. He's not there to swing and miss. He's there to hit the ball. Likewise, our freedom is there for good, is there as a means for us to develop into full union with God. And we don't have a right to misuse it. We don't have a right to miss the mark. We don't have a right to sin or to will what is evil. Okay, now again, it's one thing to say that God permits that. It's another thing to say that God respects that, and in some convoluted way that he wills it even with His permissive will. I think that we're standing on very shaky ground when we go there, and honestly, in my mind, it looks eerily like God is basically granting us a right to evil, or respecting an illusory right to sin, which I don't think doesn't sound right. God cannot deny Himself. God cannot sin, and God cannot condone sin. Permit it? Yes. But where do you draw the line? And that's where I think arguments from a free will perspective get very shaky, because where do you draw the line between God merely permitting us to commit sins and God respecting our sinful decisions to the point where they become a right? Well, I would say that those who argue from a free will perspective and say that ultimately God, for all eternity, respects a damned person's decision to damn themselves, that seems to me an awful lot like God respecting a right, not just permitting some temporary or temporal sins, but God actually respecting their right to will evil forever. I mean, we're not just talking about somebody, out of ignorance or weakness, or even stubbornness or pride, committing sins and abusing their free will. We're talking here about somebody for all eternity totally turning against God, totally, completely misusing their free will, even if there is some good mixed in there. And it seems to me an awful lot like ultimately God is therefore respecting that as a right. You have a right to damn yourself. You have a right to completely misuse free will and to misuse it forever. Okay? I mean, I don't know about you, but in my experience, when a person misuses a right or a liberty or a license, not only can it be revoked, but oftentimes it ought to be revoked. So I have a license to drive a car. If I go out there and start driving all over people's yards and deliberately try to run people down and drive right through a playground or a school, like and trying to hit children, I would expect that right would be revoked, and it ought to be. So I don't see how God refusing to revoke our supposed right to make bad decisions with our free will, I don't see how that's consonant with God as a good and loving Father. In fact, it seems very problematic to me. It makes it sound as if God is basically, again, sort of a negligent father who places in our hands, here's the keys to the car, go out and do whatever you want. And then even if we come back and say, oh, guess what, Dad, I just murdered 50 people and I destroyed, the property of 100 other people. And he says, okay, well, I wish you wouldn't do that, but keep the keys. Okay. That just doesn't seem like a very responsible thing for God to do. So that's my basic argument, is that to assume that God must respect our right to use our free will however we want, even for all eternity, to will evil and to misuse our free will, is for God, in a sense, to assume a right that we have towards evil, which seems to be just totally contradictory, not only to who he is, but to who we are and to how our free will works. Now, from a Christian universalist perspective, again, I think that this argument, all the problems of it, really disappear. Because all of a sudden now, sure, we might misuse our freedom, but ultimately God is concerned not with just maintaining our freedom, but with developing us as persons, with bringing us into fullness of union and fullness of life with him. And so he might do that through freedom. That might be one of the mechanisms or one of the means by which he helps to develop us. But ultimately, free will is not the end. So we might misuse it, and he doesn't have to uphold it all the time. He doesn't have to maintain free will at all costs. He can take away the keys or take away our license, at least temporarily if need be, if it's for our good. And especially, he doesn't have to respect the evil that we do and the bad decisions that we make. He might permit them, but he doesn't have to respect them and consider them a right, that we have a right to keep making those decisions over and over and over and over again for all eternity. He can say, no, you don't have a right to do that. And if you're not going to agree with me, I'm going to take away that liberty you have, that license you have to make free decisions, at least temporarily, until you're ready to use it properly. Like a good and loving and perhaps stern and indignant father might do sometimes. But he's doing it because his will is not just that we be free, but his will is that we all be in union with him. And freedom is a part of that. But it's not our free will is not the sine qua non of that. Our free will is actually part of what it means to become in union with God. The more and more we become in union with God, the more and more free we become. So in other words, it's not like God has to maintain our freedom so that we can make the choice to have heaven and to be in union with him. But actually, I would argue that the more and more God brings us into union with him, the more and more free we become to choose that. And the more and more free he makes us, the more and more we choose that union. And so it actually is a case of where God works in us, and yet we also work alongside him. We cooperate with him. And the two are not opposed. They're not antithetical. They actually complement each other. So anyway, if you found this interesting or helpful or edifying at all, I'd appreciate if you would like and subscribe. Share with others you think might enjoy this or benefit from it. And again, as always, please leave comments in the box below. I'd love to hear from you. Till next time, thanks for watching, and adios.